There we go. So a bunch of you just put your hand up. How many of you have actually heard of Wealthsimple? Awesome. So for like the very few of you who don't know, the 5-second elevator pitch is that we want to make investing easy and accessible for everybody. And today, the thing that I really want to dig into is what I've been thinking about as obviously future-centered design. And to my mind, there are definitely two prongs to this, both literally like in the future, but also, or in the future, like when everyone's using, the Minority Report interface. But the second prong is the future of our relationships through design. That is, the questions about how we can keep our clients or customers, happy and engaged for a long time as current users of the products that we're designing, which, as you can imagine, is pretty relevant to the work that I'm doing at Wealthsimple. And ultimately, I don't think those two things are really all that different. So I think, there's a number of questions we can ask ourselves about what future-centered actually means. One, what's going to inform UX in the future? Should we be thinking about this right now? Yes, we should. Two, what are we actually trying to describe when we say that design can be future-proofed? And three, what are the tactics and the patterns that we can actually use to ship stuff that stands the test of time? And I think this is super relevant because what we're seeing is the emergence of like a lot of things that end in tech. So, I myself work in fintech. We're seeing like med tech, insurtech, civic tech, all of these things. And I think the big differentiator here, to my mind, is that the apps we use today have a very snackable engagement horizon. So, my interaction with a tweet up there might last a couple seconds, whereas my interaction with my RRSP could last 30 or 40 years. So to the students in the audience especially, I don't want to suggest that this is a foolproof framework that I've come up with to 100% solve the problem of future-centered design. But I wanted to kind of invite you all into my thought process in terms of looking at this problem. Maybe. Or I'll just press the button. Okay, so let's imagine we have a looking glass into the future. What are we actually going to see? I mean, probably a bunch of things. New challenges to answer with design, new products and platforms, new customer relationship desires and methodologies, and probably, to answer all of this, the design process itself is going to have to change. And from this future vantage point, could somebody, 10 years from now still pick up your app or your product, and would it still make sense to them? And I think the challenge with being truly future-centered is answering, the challenge that we're already seeing from the tech industry. That is, it's very disruptive. And we've heard a lot about this today, and I think the speakers who have spoken on this have made extremely good points. Whether that disruption is good or bad, we can see this in action easily in companies like Uber, Tesla, even Dropbox, for example. So when you're designing something, you need to think about how resistant it's actually going to be to change, how well it's going to stand up to disruption. And, obviously some things really should just be ephemeral. I'm pretty sure, most BuzzFeed articles really are intended to have a shelf life of a few days, and that's fine. Those are very of-the-moment artifacts. But if we're designing something, an investment platform, for instance, where we want it to have that longevity and that ability to serve someone through their whole life, how are we actually going to get there? Before we dive too deep, I obviously want to throw down some caveats. Let's acknowledge that dealing with this rapid change is extremely difficult. And part of our challenge as product creators is certainly to help people deal with that change. people, certainly including myself in this group, really resist change. They want to hang on to the tools and the systems that they already understand. And I do think there's a tendency within some organizations, less so startups certainly, but within our older, more entrenched industries, as we literally just heard about, to really dig in and make change more difficult and exhausting than it needs to be. And I think it's certainly possible to wait too long as well to act on that future-proofing instinct. And as a result, we're often building in a very reactive rather than proactive mode. So that is, we're responding to a crisis rather than grabbing onto an opportunity. So it's extremely easy when we're in this reactive mode to just focus on the short-term results instead of looking further ahead. And by the same token, change is constant. So a great example of seizing on the opportunities presented by looking forward instead of digging in your heels is the recent transformation of Microsoft. So when Satya Nadella became the CEO a few years ago, he very, very ambitiously started to transform Microsoft into a cloud-focused, mobile-first company, basically reframing what Microsoft even could be as a company. And I don't know if anyone has worked for Microsoft or has experience, but it was a very, I want to say, sort of siloed internal competition kind of company, not really conducive to digging out of that crisis mode reactive thinking. And I think it's probably obviously way too soon to definitively call it a success or failure, but it's definitely paying dividends. If we look at products like the Surface Studio, we can see like that very proactive instead of reactive mindset at work. And to me, this very much seems like a product that was designed to get way out in front of real customer needs, rather than just responding to competitors or the market. And if we need any further indication that change is constant, the devices that we've all got in our pockets right now are a really, really great example. The Motorola Razor and the first iPhone were in the market at the same time. And I think this is like the perfect example of what I'm talking about. Tech can enable design, but let's be clear, like the iPhone was primarily a sea change in terms of user experience, not tech. The Razor was from a very long line of devices that innovated purely on tech, and the iPhone, and specifically iOS, tended to and still tends to innovate on design and experience. And we all know how that turned out. So I love this example as well. This is Amazon as it was 10 years ago, and Amazon as it was last week. And let's be clear, as with basically the entire web, Amazon has obviously got a lot better at design in that intervening 10 years. And they're doing, a lot of things we just couldn't do back then. Extremely personalized suggestions, a more focused store, way more emphasis on search, but the fundamental mission of Amazon hasn't changed. Amazon has figured out how to roll with disruption, the pace of technology, and to understand how to fit, online commerce into the shape of what the future is bringing. And again, the tech is certainly important, but it's a mistake, but it's not a mistake, it is invisible. The future-sensitive design is what moves books and engages users. So in just 20 years, we've gone from being like super, super jazzed about the entire revolutionary concept of the hyperlink and GeoCities to a world of like wearable computers and conversational interfaces. And that's like super cool stuff. And a lot of the questions of where tech are taking us revolve around the literal tech that we're going to have access to in the future. Are we going to have like that sweet Minority Report UI or like a Star Trek style voice UI? And as you might guess, I think this is focusing on the wrong thing. It's fun to think, in very science fiction terms, but the questions we should actually be answering are about what user behaviors and interactions will be available to us as designers in the future. Future-proofing, by definition, is the process of anticipating what's coming down the pipe and minimizing the shocks and the stresses of its arrival. And I'm sure as people in a creative industry or about to be in a creative industry, we're all, going to have to deal with that particular kind of project where the scope is just like every possible thing. It needs to be on iPhone, Android, tablet, desktop, TVs, the whole gamut of devices, and that's fine. We can do this. But where I think that kind of thinking leads us astray is in terms of how we're actually framing the problem that we're solving. We're thinking in terms of screen real estate, input methods, responsive layouts, rather than thinking more deeply about the outcomes over the platforms themselves. And I think this is the main differentiator between design that is very disposable and design that can really flex and adapt to future developments. Certainly, most websites and apps are going to look and act very differently, next year, 5 years on, 10 years on. And there's a certain unpredictability about what our designs are actually, or when our designs are actually going to break. And we tend to just gloss over that, I think. In a way, I think we've kind of been trained almost to think a little more short term. What's the deliverable? Who are the stakeholders? What's the work back? Instead of thinking about larger systems of delivery. How can we design systems that actually grow with time and have longevity instead of just get replaced every few years? So I'm certainly not advising that we just never update our designs, but very often we design with an extremely short shelf life, either intentionally or out of habit. And I think this is a great example. This is a digital camera, obviously designed by IKEA, not to be sold, but just to be given away as a promotional item. And then probably forgotten. How many of these just went into the dump or are forgotten in the back of drawers? Probably almost all of them. And I'm not suggesting that design can't be transitory. From a purely tech perspective, this is a super cool object. But I think we owe it to both our clients and peers to really make that effort to think longer term, to examine the longer term impact of our work. This doesn't really say much except, hey, look at this cool thing we made. But the extreme malleability and fungibility of the work that we do as digital designers encourage us to create a lot of these, throwaway, improve it later pieces of work. And instead, I would suggest that designers who want to work in a more future-proof and future-centered way should be more like architects. We need to aspire to design and build beautiful things that last. That doesn't mean, UI can evolve or adapt to new circumstances. In fact, that's basically the whole job of design. But it does mean, and it should remain reminiscent or follow naturally from the original design. Be true to a system of design rather than a single instantiation of it. In other words, let's build in some space for growth from the get-go. Think bigger than the moment. And architects have to do this because you can't generally unbuild a space or deploy a new building from GitHub, unfortunately. They have to consider both the now usage and the 20 years from now usage, both in the structure itself and the context in which it's embedded. And there are definitely both predictable and unforeseen circumstances or factors that could force us to change the design that we're shipping, emerging technology being a great example. But what I'm saying is there are design-related factors we can actually mitigate. A UI might feel outdated in terms of design or behaviors. Maybe it doesn't have the flexibility or ability to scale. It has growing inconsistencies in how it's actually been implemented. And these are all anti-future-proofing issues that they're only going to escalate and become more problematic as time goes by. So when we're actually facing a design problem, I think there's an opportunity to look at all of the factors that might potentially break our design in the future and at least rectify those that we're able to. So on the point of being an architect, I have the perfect analog for this idea in an actual real-world product or project. This is called Villa Verde. It's in Chile. It's so-called incremental housing, which was built to house people after an earthquake. And for me, the importance and what makes this project so cool is that it thinks about a very, very permanent object, somebody's actual house, in the same way that we can approach our digital products. So the architects in question could have built something very typical. Be more economic, be more of the moment, just fill in the whole structure and call it a day. And obviously that's the typical approach when you're making a building. What they did do is take that incremental approach, put the complex moving parts in place, the exterior walls, the plumbing, the electricity, all that stuff, but then left that space for future expansion. They left things actually open to the homeowners themselves to build out what made sense for them. And I think this is like an amazing metaphor for thinking about how we can start to future-proof our own design work. Design cannot be a static unit that we just drop on our clients and customers. It will always be an ongoing project. And I think what these builders have done is left space for that growth to happen in their design. So, we've got some very 10,000-foot ideas to think about in terms of how to center our design for that longer-term approach. But how can we actually implement this? How can we change our design process with actual boots-on-the-ground thinking to allow us to be both reactive and flexible enough to allow us to build the things that survive and thrive? What we're concerned here is increasing the longevity of our design thinking, not in terms of brand expression or visual standards, although obviously we should be thinking about those things, but in terms of that very atomic, granular functionality that's going to continue to serve our clients well. That is to say, I think those things that will help us survive big changes in the future rather than have to continually make big changes in the future. And this obviously isn't the final word on doing this. Everybody has their own context, and we're certainly all learning, but these are definitely some of the things that I'm thinking about and trying out as I'm trying to take a longer viewpoint on what we're building. So I think the most obvious starting point being Brad Frost's idea of atomic design. And if you're not familiar with it, the whole point of this type of system is how to approach design traversing from the very, very concrete down at the left end up to a very much more abstract level as sort of this unit that's constructed from all of these particles. And so following this system, we can really promote consistency and scalability while also keeping that flexibility. And where I think this is going to be the most important if we want to be future-centered designers is right in there. That is to say, like the fundamentals of the bits and pieces that will make up our interfaces in the future probably aren't going to change that much. The goal is still going to be the delivery of information and interactions. But we're going to have to think more about how those higher level elements, organisms in this system, come together. We're definitely not just building pages anymore, and our design needs to be flexible enough to deal with that. But the flip side of that is, or maybe the balance to it, is not to be too reductive. This is a screenshot from a very rude app called Authentic Weather. Okay, sure, it's been boiled down to basically just this one joke. And, as a funny app, okay, it succeeds. As a useful app, it's been reduced down so far to present this particular idea that it's really actually not terribly useful as a weather app. So obviously, I think we need to balance the idea of making these future-proof molecules with the idea that these things will be consumed within a context. Modularity is really just one side of the coin. A design isn't just the sum of its parts, but it's judged on like the overall holistic interactions. Your users or clients are going to encounter that work as a whole. And if we go back to thinking like an architect, and you're creating, say, a desktop and mobile website and an app, we should be thinking about what we're going to put inside those containers. Yes, they should definitely all feel of a piece, but also serve a purpose that's non-duplicative and very complementary to each other. Next, let's be super wary of trends. And this is like the perfect companion slide to my Razor and iPhone slide, because it shows perfectly how making assumptions about how things are going can really lead you astray. You probably could have extrapolated from like the gigantic brick phone on the left end down into the Razor-type flip phone. That all kind of makes sense. It's sort of, okay, I see it. But then the iPhone shows up and just like wrecks that trend line entirely. And the point being here that if we're being truly future-centered, we can't jump on any trend train, or we really shouldn't, without realizing that by doing so, we may be making design decisions that are really going to suffer from a lot of depreciation as time goes by. And as a designer, sure, it's a lot of fun to just go wild with like the latest design trend and try stuff out. But if something hasn't really been proven out to work well from a research or a UX standpoint, it's probably not a safe bet for longevity. And a great example of this is the shift around 2010 from skeuomorphism to flat design. The result of trying to reduce clutter, be more true to the digital medium, and so on. But the lesson to draw from this isn't flat design is now the thing, better get on that bandwagon immediately, but instead, how can this trend help or hinder communication and accessibility of our product? Despite the fact that the appearance has changed, the actual format and functionality of the iOS home screen, for example, has remained pretty consistent. The foundational design of it, which is, as I'm sure most of you know, a grid of tappable icons, has been pretty much the same for 10 years. That's pretty good future-proofing. And finally, let's remember that what we're really trying to do is build that long-term relationship between our design and a user. And we make a lot of assumptions about how our products might be used for reasons of practicality, or because we have limited time, or because we're just going with our gut. But if we do want to build products with longevity, we need to get better about reducing the number of assumptions that we're making. Every assumption produces a certain amount of fragility in our product. It introduces another way our UI could break for our users in the future. It could break the relationship that we're trying to build. And I think something, especially thinking about our users, is that we can build in the ability for the product itself to help us discover what those long-term user goals are. If we've done a good job in leaving that space in the house to grow into, we're in a much, much better spot to respond to new needs as they arise. So, say for instance, what do people actually want from online investment? Not just now, when they're signing up for a robo-advisor for the very first time, perhaps, but 10 years from now, 20 years from now, when they're retiring, when they're having kids, all of these other scenarios. And if I can use Wealthsimple as a living example of this principle in action, the product today is a much, much more extensive product than it was 6 months ago. And back then, it was a much more robust product than it was 6 months prior to that, and so on. So this was almost entirely driven by reacting to the needs of our customers. There was no mandate to build specific things. We just left that space for discovery. So what are our future-centered design takeaways? First, the future is certainly going to be more complicated. Let's future-proof our processes as much as we possibly can right now. Let's build those processes and approaches such that we're leaving space for ourselves to grow. Second, there's a lot of things to think about in terms of having that future-proof mindset. Chief among them, I think, thinking like an architect, being very mindful of both the permanent and transitory decisions that we're making about our products. And finally, and happily, there's a lot that we can do to help us get there. Think in modular but holistic systems that can support the needs of a relationship, not just achieve that one-off outcome. And at the end of the day, our clients and our customers really just want to be able to make choices that help them reach their own goals, and hopefully we can be there for them in the long term. Thanks very much.
Does anyone have a question for Tom? Oh.
Okay, so you guys are digitally converging a really daunting and formal industry. Do you find it easier to attract millennials and people who are new to investing, or do you find it easier to have older demographics switch over from their old ways?
That's a really good question. I think if you look at our marketing materials, the